All right, I want to move on to another story now, which caught my eye. And, it might have been if we weren't all worried about Nobby saying the N-word, might have been front page or lead story news everywhere. It was actually broken by Stuff, and hats off to Stuff. They broke it yesterday. They published the story of a public servant, a senior analyst, in fact, for the New Zealand government in the Public Service Commission, who says he has been accused of spying, essentially. He's a Chinese New Zealander. He says he was Yang Zhao was detained at Wellington Airport in October by the SIS, returning from a holiday in Australia. His phone was seized, his son's laptop was searched, and the Chinese-born New Zealand citizen has said on a fundraising website, which has since been removed from the internet, that he was then accused of being an insider threat risk because he provided privileged insights and reported to the Chinese government and held close personal relationships with officials of a foreign government in New Zealand. Now, because it is a spy thing, it's a James Bond thing, government doesn't say anything. That's policy. But is there a likelihood that China has placed spies in New Zealand and is doing terrible, dirty things with us? Well, I thought the best person to actually talk about this with would be our international guru here on the platform, Robert Patman, who has talked a lot about Ukraine. This is slightly different, but he joins us now. Robert, how are you?
Fine, thanks, Sean. Good morning. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. As with all spy stories, the truth of this is hard to find, and officials don't give you straight answers and everything, and we're left to kind of read between the lines and at the margins. Firstly, is the idea that the Chinese government would have someone, a New Zealand national with links to China inside the bureaucracy and feeding them a bit of information. Is that completely off the wall and unlikely or not?
No, I don't think it's off the wall or unlikely. China is the second most powerful country in the world after the United States. And China has become, in the last decade, particularly under Xi Jinping's leadership, much more assertive, much more China-centric, and much more determined to shape the international environment. Sometimes people have described China's brand of diplomacy under Xi as wolf warrior diplomacy. What we do know is that there has been some evidence of China's influence operations. I'm not sure they're pretty extensive in New Zealand, but there's been some evidence of them in the past. And there's certainly evidence of it in other countries. So China's view at the moment, as well as being ambitious, there's long-term ambition there to shape the international environment, and we're part of that environment. But there's also short-term insecurity. And at the moment, the world's quite threatening from a Chinese perspective. Things are not going well for the country that it's supported in the Ukraine. Its influence attempts at the Pacific are a bit mixed. It's a region that's very important to New Zealand. I think we have to keep some sort of perspective about this, Sean. China, like many great powers, would like to have the global perk of not only being powerful, but also being influential in the environment it's located. But China faces real problems in doing so.
Yeah. All right. So, and we can't say too much, but it is likely it is possible this guy is essentially what you'd call a spy, right?
Well, we can't rule it out. I couldn't comment on the case because obviously that's all subject. I understand that Mr. Zhao is appealing and vehemently denies this. The Chinese government have also denied any involvement in this. But these denials can sometimes be technical rather than substantive. We just have to wait and see how due process plays out. So I don't think we can really comment on the specifics, but I don't think we should be wildly surprised.
Yeah. Or wildly concerned at this level?
Well, I think it's important. There is a tendency in New Zealand to believe that we're immune from the sort of stuff, the dirty stuff that affects everyone else. We're not. And New Zealand's international profile has grown in the last 5 to 7 years. And we often think of ourselves as a small state of no significance to anyone else. But we live in an interconnected world, Sean, where people notice New Zealand in a way they didn't before, both for good and bad reasons. And yes, I mean, I don't think we should be surprised. Not just China, but there'll be other countries also. China's not alone. We know, from an example, from the GCSB, who've quite openly said there've been large number of cyber attacks on this country from foreign actors, and about a third of them are from authoritarian states. So, I don't think this is, without commenting on the particulars, I don't think in principle we should be surprised.
Yeah. And the fact would be, wouldn't it, Robert, there'll be cultural attaches at the American, not specifically, I'm talking hypothetically and wildly, at the American Embassy or the British High Commission, who are in effect spies. This is the way the world is, isn't it?
Yes, but there's a difference between a liberal democratic society and an authoritarian state. When liberal democracies exchange information, it's a completely different situation, I believe, because there's respect for rule of law and tolerance of dissent in a way that there isn't when one party claims or one leader claims a monopoly of political wisdom. And the dangerous thing, I mean, if you look at it from the perspective of authoritarian states, and particularly China, it's a very challenging period. China's rise to superpower status was based on its full-blooded participation in the world capitalist economy. It desperately needs and depends and relies on markets such as the US, the EU and Japan. At the same time, it's not particularly happy about some of the stances the United States and its allies take. So it's conflicted, really. It needs the global economy. At the same time, it would like to have increasing influence on it. Hence, you look at its ambiguous position over Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which captures this.
Yeah.
And, so I think that China would like to be influential in the Pacific. It's always been in the Pacific. It's too big to contain. We have to be realistic about this. But I don't think we'd be full of trepidation. Why? Because no one is queuing up to copy the one-party state. It's a deeply unattractive political system.
Yeah.
And we have to have a sense of proportion about this.
Yeah. Hey, Robert, while I've got you there, you mentioned Ukraine, and I've been incredibly busy on other stories and have kind of only got a fuzzy perception on this issue New Zealand has had with some sort of support for grain gathering technology in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Can you give us a thumbnail sketch on that issue and what's happened there?
Yes, a thumbnail sketch, not a definitive sketch. There's a very good Christchurch headquartered company that produces grain stacking machinery. And apparently that company approached the Ukrainian government round about May last year.
Yeah.
Knowing that the Ukrainians were in a desperate situation and that Ukraine depends a lot on exports, and many of its exports were blocked by the invasion and the effect of the Russian siege of the Black Sea.
Yeah.
And they said, we've got some technology here that could help you. And the Ukrainians put in a request for such assistance. But then the company in question approached the New Zealand government and asked for support, funding, so that they could put together this technology for
Ukraine.
These products, which they already produce,
Yeah.
and send them. And I think the New Zealand government reluctantly declined. They probably felt a bit miffed because
like the company was trying to make a buck off the situation.
Well, I think I actually think it was a good idea.
Yeah.
But I think they probably should have approached the New Zealand government in advance and say, this is what we're thinking. What do you think about this? Because looking forward, for a New Zealand company, it makes a lot of sense to be involved in a major food producer.
This might be an overhang, Robert, from the culture that grew up during the COVID thing, and I had so many businesses and people involved in medical research or medical production. Right. He said the government of Jacinda Ardern had this attitude that if it wasn't their idea, it couldn't be a good idea. And I wonder if that culture somehow is permeated in this matter as well.
It might have done, but you can't rule it out. But I think the other thing was, when the request was made last year, the New Zealand position was still firming up. It's much, much more, how should I put it? It's much more pro-Ukrainian now than it was then.
Yeah.
Not that we were definitely supporting Ukraine from the word go. We were one of the first countries to come out and support.
Yeah.
But I think the position in terms of our humanitarian and military aid has toughened a lot since that period, mid-May last year, and that may have something to do with it. But I still think the idea should be revisited because, it's are we doing enough to help a country which has been illegally invaded, which is a democracy and which is a non-nuclear power, and a major food producer, and wants to reform the UN Security Council like us? Are we doing enough? The Australians and the Canadians, although bigger countries, admittedly, are proportionately doing more.
Yeah. I hear you, Robert. And look, just quickly too, it is, it's March. And March is called March because in the Northern Hemisphere, that's when you marched and that's when you started your military operations again. Does this mean an uptick in activity in Ukraine? And what's the situation on the ground there?
My understanding is that the weather will have a lot to do with that, that we're entering the mud season, as the Ukrainians call it, where the snow is thawing and the ice is thawing. And they haven't got a particularly good road network in Ukraine. So it will be, I think, another month before we see really big operations on the ground because of the very sticky conditions that will be emerging in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah.
But what the Russians have done in the last 24 hours, as many of your listeners and viewers will be aware, is that the Russians just launched a massive missile strikes against Ukraine. They began about 1 a.m, went through to about 8 a.m, included a number of, they targeted energy facilities. And I think the Russians are trying to do several things here. They're trying to make Ukrainians' life as difficult as possible in order for them to persuade Ukrainian citizens to put pressure on the Zelensky government. And they may also, not unrelated to that, they may also be trying to demoralize the Ukrainian government. But many reporters over there suggest that these missile attacks, distant punishment as they're known, really have the reverse effect. They tend to make people even more defiant. And because 10 civilians have been killed overnight, which has infuriated the Ukrainians. And I don't see any, I don't think this strategy is going to work. It's going to be interesting once this massive infusion of new weaponry that the Ukrainians are in the process of receiving begins to get consolidated and used. That will be an interesting period, and that probably will occur from about May to June.
Hey, thank you very much indeed, Robert. Gee, see, the great thing with you is, I just wanted to ask you about this, and there we go. We're off on another topic. Thank you very much indeed for covering all that as you do so well for us. That is Professor Robert Patman. He's basically our anything happen overseas geopolitical go-to guy, and he's bloody good. All right, so yes, probably, maybe this guy's a spy. Does it really matter? Is the sky falling? Probably not. Oh, the old dirty Ruskies, a little bit of a missile strike, but still they're in trouble in the Ukraine. And just good to get a very thumbnail sketch. I feel like I know all I need to know about the grain stacking technology scandal involving the New Zealand government. Maybe they do need to look at that again. If we can help out the poor people of the Ukraine, we should. That'll all have all you Russian trolls going crazy, won't it? Sean, I hope you're not paying Robert for his opinion. I've never heard any guy get anything right in the interview. Oh, Chris. There you go. What, do you get a check from the Kremlin every month, Chris? Robert Patman's not an Englishman. He's a New Zealander. And he's a good New Zealander. Sean, Niwa are nothing short of lying and should be called out as liars for that by the mainstream media. There is no way that this error could be called misanalysis. More trust gone. Regards, Ian. Sean, isn't it funny that Newshub tried to cancel you again about your comments about Brendan Tarrant, then used your interviews that Michael did with Nobby without crediting you at all with unbalanced view, making out Nobby was a racist? What utter hypocrisy from them. The Newshub reporter who did the story was Kaylee Callan. Cheers, Rich. Thank you, Rich. Thank you for that very much indeed. But at least we're shaking things up a bit. This is why your opinion matters, because you express it, you listen to us, and suddenly we're changing the world as a whole, aren't we?